We live in an age that celebrates skepticism, where doubting has become a virtue and belief often treated as intellectual weakness. The modern secular individual prides themselves on having overcome superstition, rejected religious dogma, and embraced rational thought. "I'm not a believer," they declare confidently, positioning themselves as free from the psychological need for faith that has supposedly plagued humanity throughout history. This narrative of liberation from belief has become so commonplace that it forms the unquestioned backdrop of contemporary intellectual life, the assumption that human progress involves moving away from faith toward a more mature relationship with reality based purely on evidence and reason. Yet something curious happens when we observe how these proudly non-believing individuals actually structure their lives and understand the world. The atheist scientist who dismisses religious faith speaks with reverent awe about the infallibility of the scientific method. The secular humanist who rejects spiritual authority places absolute faith in human reason and moral intuition. The materialist who mocks believers for seeking cosmic meaning nevertheless constructs elaborate frameworks explaining why their own chosen pursuits possess inherent value. In each case, we find not an absence of faith, but its displacement onto different objects, a pattern so consistent that it suggests something fundamental about human psychology rather than merely differing intellectual positions. This pattern becomes even more striking when we examine how people respond when their core beliefs, religious or secular, are genuinely threatened. The religious believer whose faith is challenged may experience spiritual crisis, but the committed rationalist whose faith in reason is undermined experiences an equally profound disorientation. The scientist confronted with the philosophical limitations of the scientific method often reacts not with calm acceptance, but with defensive indignation, strikingly similar to religious apologetics. These parallel reactions suggest that what's operating in both cases isn't merely intellectual preference, but something more fundamental to human psychological functioning, a need to organize experience around certain core certainties that remain themselves unquestioned. A 19th century philosopher, often mischaracterized as simply anti-religious, developed a revolutionary perspective that might explain this pattern. His insight wasn't merely that religious belief might be psychologically motivated rather than factually grounded, a commonplace observation in his intellectual milieu, but that the human need for faith operates universally, even among those who most vociferously reject traditional belief. This wasn't a defense of religion, but a more profound psychological observation, that the will to believe is not a peculiarity of the religious mind, but a fundamental feature of human consciousness itself, merely expressed through different channels depending on cultural context and individual disposition. What if faith isn't merely an optional approach to reality that some choose and others reject, but an inescapable aspect of how human consciousness structures experience? What if the question isn't whether you have faith, but only what form your inevitable faith takes and whether you recognize it as such? And what if the most profound freedom comes not from rejecting faith altogether, which may be psychologically impossible, but from recognizing and acknowledging our universal need to believe? The kind implications would transform not just how we understand religion, but how we conceive of human knowledge, values, and meaning-making across all domains. I invite you to consider a perspective so subtle yet provocative that it challenges both religious certainty and secular confidence equally. What if the true division isn't between believers and non-believers at all, but between those who recognize their own acts of faith and those who remain unconscious of the faith-based foundations of their own worldview? Let's examine a curious phenomenon that appears consistently across intellectual history. The more vehemently individuals reject faith as a category, the more likely they are to demonstrate unwavering belief in something else, often without recognizing the structural similarity between their commitment and religious faith. This pattern appears too consistently to be coincidental and suggests something fundamental about how human consciousness operates, rather than merely reflecting different intellectual positions. Consider how the great critics of religion throughout history have almost invariably replaced traditional faith with equally absolute commitment to alternative frameworks. The Enlightenment thinkers who rejected Christian revelation embraced an almost religious faith in human reason's capacity to discover universal truth. The 19th century positivists who dismissed metaphysics as meaningless nonetheless treated scientific methodology with a reverence structurally identical to religious devotion. The 20th century materialists who rejected all forms of spirituality often displayed extraordinary faith in historical determinism or technological progress. In each case, the rejection of explicit faith coincided with implicit faith merely directed toward different objects. This pattern extends beyond intellectual frameworks to how individuals structure their daily lives and find meaning. Study the committed atheist closely, and you'll typically discover organizing principles that function exactly like religious faith. Core assumptions that remain unexamined, values treated as self-evidently true rather than merely preferred, and experiences of meaning that transcend rational justification. The scientist feels awe before the elegance of natural laws in ways structurally identical to religious wonder. The secular humanist experiences moral imperatives with the same sense of transcendent obligation that characterizes religious ethics. The rationalist derives meaning from truth-seeking with the same psychological dynamics that motivate religious devotion. Even more telling is how people respond when their foundational commitments, religious or secular, are fundamentally challenged. The reactions display striking similarities regardless of content. Initial denial, emotional distress, defensive rationalization, appeal to authority, and if the challenge persists, either a crisis of faith or deeper entrenchment. These parallel responses suggest that what's operating isn't merely intellectual disagreement, but threat to the psychological structures through which individuals make experience coherent and meaningful. Structures that serve identical functions whether their content is religious or secular. Most revealing is the phenomenon of conversion between religious and secular worldviews. Those who move from religious faith to atheism or from atheism to religious belief typically describe not the elimination or creation of faith as a psychological function, but its redirection toward new objects. Former religious believers don't report learning to live without faith, but discovering new foundations for certainty and meaning. Former atheists don't describe developing a previously absent capacity for faith, but recognizing that what they interpreted as purely rational commitment already contained elements of faith they hadn't acknowledged. These conversion narratives suggest that faith as a psychological structure remains constant even as its content changes. These anomalies point toward a revolutionary possibility. What if faith isn't a peculiar feature of the religious mind, but a universal aspect of human consciousness, an inescapable psychological function through which we render experience coherent and meaningful? What if the choice isn't between having faith or not having it, but only between different objects of faith and different degrees of consciousness about our inevitable acts of belief? And which philosopher saw this pattern with such clarity that his insight has been systematically misunderstood by both religious and secular audiences, equally invested in maintaining the illusory division between believers and non-believers? In 1880, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a small rented room in the Swiss mountain village of Sils Maria. His health was deteriorating. Debilitating migraines, severe digestive problems, and failing eyesight had forced him to resign his university position. Isolated, physically suffering, and financially precarious, Nietzsche entered what would become his most philosophically productive period. It was here, amid physical pain and existential uncertainty, that he developed his revolutionary insights about the universal human need for faith, insights that would challenge both religious believers and their secular critics equally. What positioned Nietzsche uniquely to see what others couldn't was his unusual intellectual journey. Raised in a devoutly religious household, his father was a Lutheran pastor, he had intimate first-hand knowledge of religious psychology from the inside. Yet unlike many critics of religion, Nietzsche hadn't simply replaced religious faith with uncritical secular faith. His training in philology, the meticulous historical analysis of texts and concepts, gave him extraordinary sensitivity to how ideas evolve and transform rather than simply appearing or disappearing. This combination of religious background, philosophical training, and philological methodology allowed him to recognize patterns in human belief that others missed entirely. During his daily walks through the alpine landscape, when his health permitted, Nietzsche contemplated a question that few had asked directly. Is faith a peculiar feature of the religious mind? Or might it represent something more fundamental about how human consciousness functions? Rather than accepting the common Enlightenment narrative that humanity was progressing from faith toward reason, he examined how supposedly rational frameworks might themselves operate through psychological mechanisms identical to religious belief. This approach led to a revolutionary insight. Faith might be not an optional approach to reality that some choose and others reject, but an inescapable aspect of how human consciousness renders experience coherent and meaningful. In his notebook from this period, later published as The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote, "The most common form of human stupidity is forgetting what one is trying to do." By this he meant that the secular critics of religion had forgotten their own original purpose, not to eliminate faith, but to direct it toward worthier objects. Instead, they had created the illusion that they operated without faith altogether, becoming unconscious of their own acts of belief while criticizing the conscious beliefs of others. This insight wasn't a defense of traditional religion, but a more profound psychological observation, that the will to believe operates universally, merely expressed through different channels depending on cultural context and individual disposition. What distinguished Nietzsche's analysis from mere criticism of atheism or secularism was his recognition that faith serves essential psychological functions regardless of its content. During those solitary mountain walks, he began developing what he called the psychology of all belief, an understanding that human consciousness inevitably organizes experience around certain core certainties that remain themselves unquestioned. These acts of faith aren't irrational flaws to be eliminated, but fundamental features of how mind relates to reality, the necessary simplifications through which the overwhelming complexity of existence becomes navigable and meaningful. In his personal letters from this period, Nietzsche described his goal not as defending traditional faith against its critics, but exposing the unacknowledged faith operating within supposed non-belief. The secular modern believes he has escaped the need for faith entirely, and in this very belief demonstrates its inescapability. This wasn't mere clever rhetoric, but a profound psychological insight, that the human need for certain foundational commitments that exceed evidence and justification is universal, operating even in those who explicitly reject faith as a category. The question isn't whether one has faith, but only what form it takes and whether one recognizes it as such. As Nietzsche walked among the peaks of the Swiss Alps, he was developing insights about belief that wouldn't merely critique religion or its absence, but would challenge the very framework through which both believers and non-believers understood themselves and each other. What if the most profound self-awareness comes not from either embracing or rejecting faith, but from recognizing the inevitable role that faith plays in all human consciousness? Nietzsche's first compelling evidence appears in his analysis of how Enlightenment rationalism evolved historically. In Human All Too Human, published in 1878, he traces how the supposedly rational frameworks that replaced religious faith preserved the exact psychological structures they claimed to overcome. The Enlightenment's faith in universal reason, its reverence for scientific method, and its moral certainties weren't the elimination of religious psychology, but its redirection toward new objects. This wasn't random correlation, but causal connection. The new secular certainties emerged directly from the psychological needs previously served by religious belief. Consider the historical pattern. As traditional religious certainty declined in European intellectual circles, new forms of certainty emerged with striking rapidity. The scientific method became not merely a useful approach, but an infallible path to truth. Human rights transformed from philosophical concept to self-evident moral truth. Progress became not just a possibility, but an inevitable historical law. These new certainties weren't developed through purely rational processes, but emerged to fill the psychological vacuum left by receding religious faith. The speed and intensity with which these new objects of devotion appeared suggests they weren't merely intellectual positions but responses to fundamental psychological needs. The evidence extends beyond conceptual evolution to specific textual analysis. Nietzsche examined how the language used to describe secular commitments preserved religious psychological structures despite changed content. Scientific texts described natural laws with the same reverence previously reserved for divine commandments. Political manifestos promise secular salvation with rhetoric, identical to religious redemption narratives. Philosophical systems claim to reveal ultimate reality using structural patterns identical to religious revelation. This linguistic continuity reveals not merely cultural habit, but deeper psychological continuity. The same fundamental structures of belief operating through new content. Literary evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Analyzing the great novels of his period, Nietzsche identified how characters rejecting traditional faith invariably developed alternative devotions structured identically to what they rejected. Dostoevsky's atheists replaced God with political ideology or rational egoism, but maintained the psychological structure of absolute commitment. Flaubert's secular protagonists transferred religious psychology onto romantic love or aesthetic experience. Turgenev's rationalist characters demonstrated faith-like certainty in scientific materialism. These literary representations captured a psychological reality that philosophical analysis often missed. The persistence of faith as a structure despite transformation of its content. Perhaps most revealing is the evidence from intellectual biographies. Nietzsche collected accounts from prominent atheists, agnostics, and religious skeptics, identifying a consistent pattern. Explicit rejection of faith coincided with implicit transference of faith psychology onto new objects. Auguste Comte rejected metaphysics as meaningless while developing a religion of humanity with devotional practices and moral certainties structured identically to what he criticized. Ludwig Feuerbach dismissed God as human projection while maintaining absolute faith in the redemptive power of properly directed human love. Karl Marx rejected religious hope for future salvation while preserving its exact psychological structure in revolutionary expectation of the communist future. These weren't merely intellectual inconsistencies, but demonstrations of the inescapability of faith as a psychological function. All these evidence streams converge on a revolutionary conclusion. Faith isn't merely one possible approach to reality that some choose and others reject, but a fundamental feature of how human consciousness renders experience coherent and meaningful. The secular rejection of traditional faith doesn't eliminate the psychological need for certain foundational commitments that exceed evidence and justification. It merely redirects this need toward different objects, while often concealing its operation from conscious awareness. If Nietzsche is correct, then the most profound self-understanding comes not from either embracing or rejecting faith, but from recognizing its inevitable operation in all human consciousness. To understand how faith operates universally across both religious and secular consciousness, we must examine what Nietzsche called the psychology of belief formation. This process begins not with rational evaluation of evidence, but with a more fundamental need, the human requirement for sufficient cognitive stability to enable action. When faced with the overwhelming complexity of existence and the practical necessity of response, consciousness inevitably simplifies through commitment to certain foundational assumptions that cannot themselves be fully justified, but make coherent understanding and action possible. This psychological mechanism operates whether the content of those assumptions is religious or secular. This belief formation process follows predictable patterns that Nietzsche identified across diverse contexts. First comes the encounter with complexity that exceeds complete rational comprehension, whether the nature of existence, moral obligation, historical meaning, or personal purpose. Next arises the need for sufficient certainty to enable coherent understanding and decisive action, despite incomplete information. Then emerges the psychological solution: commitment to certain foundational assumptions that cannot themselves be fully justified, but make navigation of complexity possible. The final stage involves naturalizing these assumptions, forgetting their status as psychological necessities and experiencing them as discoveries about reality itself. This process isn't a flaw in human rationality, but its necessary condition, the means through which overwhelming complexity becomes navigable. Nietzsche documented this pattern in both religious and secular frameworks with striking parallelism. Religious belief begins with foundational commitments: God's existence, revelation's authority, the soul's reality that cannot be proven but make a coherent worldview possible. Yet secular frameworks demonstrate identical structure: commitment to reason's reliability, evidence as the path to truth, consciousness as capable of knowing reality, none of which can be established without circular reasoning. In both cases, certain foundational assumptions must be taken on faith to make any further knowledge possible. The difference lies not in whether faith operates, but only in its objects and the degree of awareness about its necessity. The evidence becomes even more compelling when examining how people defend their core commitments when challenged. Nietzsche collected accounts showing how both religious and secular individuals respond to fundamental challenges with strikingly similar strategies, appealing to the self-evidence of their foundational assumptions, questioning the challenger's motives rather than addressing the challenge directly, shifting from logical to moral language by suggesting the challenge is not merely incorrect, but somehow improper. These defensive patterns appear with such consistency across otherwise diverse contexts that they suggest a universal psychological mechanism rather than merely particular intellectual positions. Modern cognitive science has substantially confirmed Nietzsche's insights. Research on human reasoning consistently shows that even the most rational individuals begin with certain unquestioned assumptions and engage primarily in what psychologists call motivated reasoning, not dispassionate evaluation, but defense of core commitments already held. Studies demonstrate that increased intelligence and education correlate not with less belief, but with greater capacity to defend existing beliefs against challenge. These findings support Nietzsche's understanding that faith, in the sense of commitment beyond complete rational justification, operates universally rather than only in those who explicitly identify as religious. What's particularly significant about this evidence is how it explains both the persistence of faith across cultural transformations and the peculiar blindness of secular consciousness to its own faith commitments. If faith is a fundamental feature of how human consciousness functions, rather than merely one cultural option among others, we would expect precisely what we observe. As traditional religious content declines, the psychological structures of faith transfer to new objects rather than disappearing. And because modern secular culture defines faith narrowly as religious belief rather than recognizing it as a universal psychological function, those operating through secular forms of faith can remain sincerely unaware of the structural similarity between their own foundational commitments and those they reject in religious believers. Nietzsche's analysis reveals that what distinguishes religious from secular consciousness isn't the presence or absence of faith, but only its explicit acknowledgement. Religious frameworks typically recognize and embrace the role of faith, while secular frameworks often maintain the illusion of operating without it. A difference not in psychological structure, but in self-awareness about that structure's universal operation. As we assemble the evidence, a consistent pattern emerges that Nietzsche articulated in Beyond Good and Evil, but that has been systematically misinterpreted by both religious and secular readers. What he called the will to believe isn't limited to religious consciousness, but operates universally as a fundamental feature of how human mind relates to reality. This pattern has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between faith and reason, religious and secular consciousness, belief, and knowledge. The pattern begins with how humans establish knowledge in any domain. Across disciplines, Nietzsche observed a consistent structure. All knowledge systems rest ultimately on certain foundational assumptions that cannot themselves be fully justified without circular reasoning. Scientific method assumes the reliability of empirical observation and the universality of natural laws, assumptions that cannot be proven scientifically without presupposing what they claim to establish. Moral reasoning assumes the reality of values beyond mere preference, an assumption that cannot be ethically justified without already accepting ethical reality. Historical understanding assumes meaningful patterns beyond random events, an assumption that cannot be historically validated without presuming historical meaning. This recursive structure isn't a flaw, but a necessary feature of how finite consciousness establishes sufficient stability to navigate infinite complexity. At the psychological level, the pattern continues with what Nietzsche called the faith beneath knowledge. Every individual, regardless of religious or secular identification, organizes experience around certain core certainties that function as articles of faith. These foundational commitments aren't necessarily irrational. They may be well considered and pragmatically justified, but they exceed complete rational demonstration precisely because they establish the framework within which rational demonstration becomes possible. This psychological structure appears with such consistency across otherwise diverse worldviews that it suggests a universal feature of human consciousness rather than a peculiarity of particular belief systems. The historical pattern reveals itself in how faith transforms rather than disappears through cultural evolution. As traditional religious frameworks declined in Western societies, the psychological structures of faith transferred to new objects with remarkable conservation of function, if not content. Faith in divine providence became faith in historical progress. Faith in divine moral law became faith in self-evident human rights. Faith in revealed truth became faith in scientific method. Faith in salvation through grace became faith in liberation through political revolution. This consistent pattern of transference suggests that what changes historically isn't the psychological function of faith, but only its objects and degree of self-consciousness about its operation. Perhaps most revealing is the pattern Nietzsche identified in how individuals respond to existential uncertainty. When confronted with the fundamental mysteries of existence, the meaning of suffering, the basis of value, the finality of death, both religious and secular individuals demonstrate the same psychological structure: commitment beyond what evidence alone could justify. The religious believer may commit to divine purpose beyond human understanding, while the secular individual may commit to human meaning creation despite cosmic indifference. But in both cases, the psychological structure is identical: a leap beyond complete rational justification to establish sufficient certainty for meaningful action. This parallel response suggests that faith operates not merely as one cultural option among others, but as a universal psychological necessity. The pattern extends to how communities form around shared certainties. Nietzsche documented how both religious and secular groups demonstrate identical sociological features: boundary maintenance through shared commitment to foundational assumptions, hierarchies of authority based on superior understanding or embodiment of those assumptions, rituals that reinforce collective certainty, and moral frameworks that identify proper relationship to foundational commitments. Whether we examine religious congregations or scientific disciplines, political movements or philosophical schools, the same basic pattern appears: communities organized around shared faith in certain fundamental commitments that exceed complete rational justification but enable collective meaning and action. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is the modern secular redefinition of faith as specifically religious belief. By narrowing the concept to particular content rather than recognizing it as a universal psychological function, modern discourse creates the illusion that faith operates only in the explicitly religious, while secular thought proceeds without it. This conceptual sleight of hand allows secular consciousness to remain unaware of its own acts of faith while critiquing the faith of others, creating the very blind spot that Nietzsche's analysis illuminates. The implications of Nietzsche's analysis extend far beyond academic philosophy into the practical reality of how we understand ourselves and engage with those who hold different foundational commitments. If faith operates as a universal psychological function rather than merely one cultural option among others, then many of our basic assumptions about the relationship between religious and secular consciousness require fundamental reconsideration. This isn't merely a theoretical concern, but has profound consequences for intellectual honesty, cross-worldview dialogue, and authentic self-understanding. First, we must confront what Nietzsche called the illusion of faithlessness, the mistaken belief that secular frameworks operate without faith merely because they direct faith toward different objects. When faith is recognized as commitment beyond complete rational justification rather than specifically religious belief, it becomes clear that everyone, religious or secular, believer or skeptic, operates through foundational commitments that cannot be fully demonstrated without circular reasoning. The difference lies not in the presence or absence of faith, but in its objects, its degree of conscious acknowledgement, and the frameworks through which it expresses itself. This recognition doesn't relativize all beliefs, but establishes more honest ground for evaluating different faith commitments according to their consequences, rather than pretending some operate without faith altogether. The intellectual implications are equally significant. If all knowledge systems rest ultimately on certain foundational assumptions that cannot themselves be fully justified, then the modern opposition between faith and reason requires fundamental revision. Faith and reason aren't competing approaches to reality, but complementary aspects of how human consciousness functions. Faith providing the foundational commitments that make rational inquiry possible, reason operating within the frameworks that faith establishes. This doesn't mean abandoning rational standards or critical thinking, but recognizing their operation within broader psychological contexts that necessarily include elements of faith. The truly rational thinker isn't one who has eliminated faith, but one who has become conscious of how faith inevitably operates within their own thinking. For dialogue across different worldviews, the implications are particularly transformative. If both religious and secular frameworks operate through faith commitments expressed in different content and contexts, then dialogue requires not overcoming faith but developing greater consciousness about how faith functions universally. Rather than religious believers and secular thinkers approaching each other as fundamentally different kinds of consciousness, one operating through faith, the other through reason, both can recognize their shared psychological structure expressed through different content. This creates the possibility for more honest engagement based on examining the consequences of different faith commitments, rather than maintaining the illusion that some operate without faith altogether. Perhaps most profound is the implication for individual self-understanding. If faith operates inevitably in all human consciousness, then genuine intellectual maturity comes not from overcoming faith, but from becoming conscious of one's own necessary acts of faith. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the free spirit isn't someone who has eliminated faith, but someone who has recognized its inevitable operation in their own thinking and developed the capacity to examine and revise their faith commitments rather than remaining unconscious of them. This reconceived intellectual freedom isn't the illusory absence of faith, but greater consciousness about faith's necessary role in how mind relates to reality. This doesn't mean all faith commitments are equally valid or beneficial. Nietzsche maintained clear distinctions between life-affirming and life-denying forms of faith, between conscious and unconscious belief, between faith that enables growth and faith that prevents it. The question isn't whether to have faith, which may be psychologically impossible, but what form one's inevitable faith takes, whether one recognizes it as faith, and what consequences it has for life and thought. This understanding allows for critical evaluation of different faith commitments without maintaining the fiction that some operate without faith altogether. These implications suggest a radical but liberating possibility. What if the most profound self-understanding requires not overcoming faith, but becoming conscious of how faith inevitably operates within our own thinking? What if the truly free thinker isn't one who has eliminated belief, but one who has developed the capacity to recognize, examine, and when necessary, revise their own inevitable acts of faith? Why has this understanding of faith as universal psychological function, rather than merely religious content, been so consistently overlooked or actively misinterpreted? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of certainty, not a conscious deception, but a multi-layered system that maintains the illusion that some frameworks operate without faith, while others are defined by it. This conspiracy serves psychological and social purposes that extend far beyond mere conceptual confusion. The psychological dimension of this conspiracy involves what Nietzsche called the will to certainty at any cost. He observed how strongly humans prefer the sense of operating from secure knowledge rather than acknowledging the faith commitments that underlie even our most rational frameworks. When secular individuals define faith narrowly as religious belief, rather than recognizing it as a universal psychological function, they create a false sense of security, the illusion that their own commitments rest on firmer ground than the faith they critique in others. This psychological preference for imagined certainty over acknowledged faith creates powerful resistance to recognizing how faith operates universally, making Nietzsche's insight threatening at the most fundamental psychological level. Institutionally, maintaining the faith-reason dichotomy creates significant advantages. Academic institutions position themselves as authorities based on commitment to reason rather than faith, distinguishing their knowledge claims from those of religious institutions. Scientific disciplines establish authority through the claim that they operate through pure empiricism, rather than any form of belief. Political systems justify power through appeals to self-evident rights or historical necessity, rather than acknowledging the faith commitments underlying these frameworks. If faith were recognized as operating universally, rather than only in religious contexts, these institutional claims to special epistemological status would require fundamental revision. This institutional self-protection helps explain why perspectives highlighting the universal operation of faith are consistently marginalized or misinterpreted. The cultural dimension of the conspiracy operates through language and conceptual frameworks. Nietzsche analyzed how modern discourse systematically narrows the concept of faith to mean specifically religious belief, rather than recognizing it as the broader psychological function of commitment beyond complete rational justification. Terms like evidence-based, rational, and scientific are positioned as opposites of faith, rather than as expressions of particular faith commitments. This linguistic and conceptual framing makes it nearly impossible to recognize how faith operates universally, as the very concepts through which we might recognize this have been defined to exclude the possibility. The result is a form of cultural blindness that preserves the illusion that some frameworks operate without faith, while others are defined by it. Educational systems further reinforce this conspiracy. Nietzsche observed how modern education emphasizes critical thinking, empirical methodology, and rational analysis without acknowledging the faith commitments that make these approaches possible. Students learn to identify and critique faith in religious contexts while remaining unaware of the foundational assumptions operating in secular frameworks. This educational one-sidedness creates individuals skilled at recognizing faith in others but lacking the conceptual tools to identify their own inevitable acts of faith. The result is a peculiar form of intellectual blindness, where one can analyze others' faith with sophistication while remaining sincerely unaware of how faith operates in one's own thinking. Perhaps most insidious is what Nietzsche called the moralization of epistemology. By presenting faith as intellectual weakness and reason as intellectual virtue, modern frameworks effectively prevent recognition of how faith operates universally. Suggesting that secular frameworks might operate through faith commitments similar in structure to religious belief becomes not merely a controversial position, but a kind of intellectual sin, evidence of insufficient commitment to rational standards. This moral framing makes critical examination of the faith-reason dichotomy seem not merely intellectually challenging but ethically suspect, creating powerful normative pressure to maintain the illusion that some frameworks operate without faith altogether. The result is a comprehensive system that maintains the faith-reason dichotomy despite evidence suggesting that faith operates as a universal psychological function across all forms of human consciousness. This conspiracy persists not primarily through conscious deception, but through interlocking psychological, institutional, cultural, and educational mechanisms that collectively prevent recognition of how faith operates universally, rather than merely in religious contexts. The most disturbing aspect of Nietzsche's insight isn't just its implication that faith operates universally, but the systematic ways this understanding has been actively misinterpreted whenever it appears. His analysis of this pattern revealed not just disagreement with his position, but a specific immune response that operates whenever the universality of faith is suggested. This pattern appears with remarkable consistency across both religious and secular contexts, suggesting not random resistance, but a predictable reaction to a perspective that threatens fundamental assumptions about human knowledge and identity. The primary mechanism for this misinterpretation has been what Nietzsche called the false polarization. When philosophers or psychologists suggest that faith operates universally across both religious and secular consciousness, their perspective is routinely forced into one of two false categories, either defending religion against its critics or attacking the validity of all knowledge claims. Religious readers often misinterpret the recognition of faith in secular frameworks as validating religious faith specifically rather than identifying a universal psychological function. Secular readers frequently misinterpret the same insight as promoting relativism or undermining the possibility of reliable knowledge, rather than clarifying its actual psychological foundations. This dual misinterpretation effectively prevents the genuine insight from being engaged on its own terms. This mischaracterization serves a specific function. It maintains the comfortable polarization between believers and non-believers that allows both groups to preserve their self-understanding. By forcing the universal faith perspective into either pro-religion apologetics or anti-knowledge relativism, this interpretive move prevents recognition of a more challenging possibility, that the genuine distinction isn't between those who have faith and those who don't, but between those who recognize their own acts of faith and those who remain unconscious of them. This false choice, either defend religion or attack knowledge, has been the primary mechanism through which Nietzsche's actual insight has been rendered culturally unintelligible, despite its profound psychological and philosophical significance. Academic authorities reinforced this misinterpretation through selective reading of texts examining the universality of faith. Nietzsche documented how passages suggesting faith might operate universally were consistently reinterpreted to fit within the established faith-reason dichotomy. When he suggested that scientific frameworks operate through faith commitments, similar in structure to religious belief, academic readers routinely misinterpreted him as attacking science's validity rather than clarifying its psychological foundations. When he identified faith operating in secular philosophical systems, readers interpreted this as critique of those specific systems rather than recognition of a universal psychological function. This selective interpretation creates the impression that all significant thinkers ultimately affirm the faith-reason dichotomy, when closer analysis reveals far more nuance and complexity in how many have understood the relationship between belief and knowledge. Institutional mechanisms further enforce this misinterpretation. Nietzsche observed how academic and cultural institutions consistently position perspectives highlighting the universality of faith as belonging to particular ideological camps rather than potentially transcending established categories. Suggesting that faith operates universally gets categorized as either religious apologetics or postmodern relativism, effectively containing the more radical implication that the very dichotomy between faith-based and non-faith-based thinking might be illusory. This institutional categorization prevents serious consideration of how faith might function as a universal aspect of human consciousness rather than merely one cultural approach among others. Cultural reinforcement extends this misinterpretation beyond formal philosophical contexts. Nietzsche documented how popular representations consistently portray faith and reason as opposing rather than complementary aspects of how mind relates to reality. Films, novels, and public discourse routinely depict religious individuals as operating through faith, while secular figures proceed through pure rationality, never acknowledging how faith commitments operate in both, merely with different content and degrees of self-awareness. This cultural representation creates a background assumption that some frameworks operate without faith, despite evidence suggesting its universal operation in human psychology. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of recognition. He collected numerous accounts of individuals who, through direct experience, recognized how faith operated within their own, supposedly non-faith-based thinking, moments of realizing that their most rational frameworks rested ultimately on certain unprovable assumptions functionally identical to religious faith. Yet when they attempted to articulate these recognitions, they were systematically misunderstood, their insights reinterpreted to fit within established categories, or dismissed as temporary confusion rather than genuine psychological insight. This created a situation where direct experience that might challenge the faith-reason dichotomy was effectively excluded from intellectual discourse, maintaining the illusion that faith operates only in specifically religious contexts rather than universally. This multi-layered misinterpretation has resulted in what Nietzsche termed the Great Misunderstanding, a collective failure to recognize the universality of faith as a psychological function and the consequent illusion that some frameworks operate without faith, while others are defined by it. This misunderstanding persists not because Nietzsche's insight is particularly obscure or complex, but because it threatens fundamental assumptions about human knowledge and identity that both religious and secular consciousness have powerful incentives to maintain. The consequence of this systematic misinterpretation is a peculiar form of cultural blindness, where the most basic feature of how human consciousness relates to reality, The inevitable role of faith in establishing the foundational commitments that make coherent understanding possible remains largely unrecognized despite its universal operation. This blindness serves psychological and social purposes, allowing both religious and secular individuals to maintain comforting illusions about the grounds of their own certainties while critiquing the certainties of others. But it comes at the cost of genuine self-understanding and honest dialogue across different worldviews. The final question isn't whether faith exists in both religious and secular consciousness, but what becomes possible when we recognize its universal operation rather than maintaining the illusion that some frameworks proceed without it. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't an attack on either religious belief or rational inquiry, but an invitation to more profound self-understanding, recognizing how faith inevitably functions in all human consciousness and developing greater awareness of our own necessary acts of belief. This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand faith itself. Rather than defining it narrowly as religious belief, we might recognize it as the broader psychological function of commitment beyond complete rational justification, the necessary foundation that makes any coherent understanding of reality possible. This reconceptualized faith isn't the opposite of reason, but its prerequisite, the foundational commitments that establish the frameworks within which rational inquiry becomes possible. The question shifts from whether one has faith to what form one's inevitable faith takes, whether one recognizes it as faith, and what consequences it has for life and thought. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of the illusory ideal of belief-free thinking, you might cultivate what Nietzsche called the intellectual conscience, rigorous honesty about your own inevitable acts of faith. This doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or rational standards, but becoming conscious of the foundational commitments that make these very approaches possible. The truly rational thinker isn't one who has eliminated faith, but one who has developed the capacity to recognize, examine, and when necessary, revise their own inevitable acts of belief. For dialogue across different worldviews, this understanding offers revolutionary possibilities. Rather than religious believers and secular thinkers approaching each other as fundamentally different kinds of consciousness, one operating through faith, the other through reason, both can recognize their shared psychological structure expressed through different content. The question becomes not whether faith operates in your thinking, but what specific faith commitments organize your understanding, why you hold them rather than others, and what consequences they have for life and thought. This creates the possibility for more honest engagement based on examining different faith commitments rather than maintaining the fiction that some proceed without faith altogether. This understanding illuminates why the fiercest critics of faith often demonstrate the most absolute faith in their own frameworks. The passionate atheist who dismisses religious belief while maintaining unwavering faith in scientific materialism. The committed rationalist who rejects religious doctrine while treating human rights as self-evident truths. The secular humanist who critiques religious morality while maintaining absolute faith in human moral intuition. All demonstrate not the absence of faith, but its displacement onto different objects, with less conscious acknowledgement of its operation. Recognizing this pattern doesn't invalidate their critiques but places them in proper context, not as faith-free perspectives challenging faith itself, but as different faith commitments engaging each other without recognizing their shared psychological structure. The transformation extends to how we understand intellectual development itself. If faith operates inevitably in all human consciousness, then intellectual maturity involves not eliminating faith, but developing greater consciousness about one's own acts of belief. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the free spirit isn't someone who has overcome faith, but someone who has recognized its necessity while developing the capacity to examine and revise specific faith commitments rather than remaining unconscious of them. This reconceived intellectual freedom isn't the illusory absence of faith, but greater awareness of how faith actually functions within one's own thinking. For those who have experienced the collapse of specific faith commitments, whether religious or secular, this perspective offers not despair, but liberation. Rather than interpreting such collapse as evidence that all certainty is illusion, you might recognize it as the natural evolution of faith commitments that remain necessary but can transform in content and consciousness. The question isn't whether to have faith, but what specific faith commitments will organize your understanding moving forward, and whether you'll hold them with greater awareness of their nature as faith, rather than maintaining the illusion that you've progressed beyond faith altogether. The invitation is clear. Rather than maintaining the comforting fiction that you've overcome the need for faith, while unconsciously displacing it onto different objects, you might develop what Nietzsche called the great health, the capacity to recognize, acknowledge, and consciously engage with your own inevitable acts of belief. This isn't abandoning intellectual standards, but establishing them on more honest psychological foundations, not pretending to certainty beyond what's possible for finite consciousness, but engaging reality through conscious faith commitments held with appropriate humility and openness to revision. Will you continue participating in the collective fiction that divides humanity into believers who have faith and non-believers who proceed through pure reason? Or will you have the courage to recognize that the true division isn't between those who have faith and those who don't, but between those who acknowledge their own acts of faith and those who remain unconscious of the faith-based foundations of their own worldview? The real faith that nobody confesses isn't religious belief, specifically, but the universal human need for foundational commitments that exceed complete rational justification while making coherent understanding possible. The path to genuine intellectual freedom lies not in the illusory transcendence of faith, but in greater consciousness about how faith inevitably operates within your own thinking,